Hello, UCAR. Peter Christensen here, coming to you from the CEO's desk. Going to talk today about a scenario that, I guess one we don't want to find ourselves in. So now that the settlement requires that a written agreement be put in place prior to showing properties, right? Showing properties to a buyer. Now, let's be clear about that. It's working on behalf of the buyer, right? So, for instance, if we're sitting in open house and an unrepresented buyer comes through, and you're sitting in the open house really on behalf of the seller, right? You're holding the open house. You're showing it to buyers that are represented by agents. Maybe even showing it just to agents, whatever. But someone comes through and says, "Nah, I'm just looking. Are you represented by someone?" "No, but curious neighbor, whatever. Maybe a prospective buyer." But the big question is, do I need something in writing with that buyer because of the settlement terms? My understanding is no. Because you're not working with that buyer at that point, right? You're just working on behalf of the seller, showing the home on behalf of the seller. And so I don't think you've crossed that line to now you're working with the buyer. Because like I said, you don't get anything in writing for that agent that comes through or the agent with a buyer that comes through because you're not working for them. And I think the same thing, unrepresented buyer. Now, if you say, "Do you want me to represent you before I show this house?" then yeah, get something in writing. So really wasn't the purpose of this video, that little tidbit. Bonus material. So, okay. But because these are signed rather early, you run into the risk of coming across a buyer who is represented or has some sort of written agreement in place. And what do we do to avoid that? And how do we navigate that new reality? Now, let's be clear. It was always a reality. It was always a possibility that a buyer had already signed an agreement with another agent. So that's not new. Again, not new. But now that you're maybe pushing to get those things signed a little earlier than you had prior to the settlement, maybe not. Maybe you guys were getting them signed, upon first showing anyway. Okay, but the reality is you come across a buyer. Let's say buyer contacts you. "Yeah, I'd like to see this house." You say, "Okay, fantastic. Brokerage practice. We get these things signed," and you explain what it is. But in the back of your mind, you're wondering, did this buyer already sign something with another agent? So it's all about communication, right? I'm going to go back to the standards set out by Article 16 of the Code of Ethics. And I think it's Standard Practice 16-9. It says something like that a realtor has an affirmative obligation to make reasonable efforts to determine whether the prospect is subject to a current valid agreement for the same services. Paraphrasing a little there. So the two operative words, affirmative obligation to make reasonable efforts. Now, I don't know what standard the state governing authority will take, but I would imagine it's something similar. So let's break this down. Have an affirmative obligation. So the obligation is affirmative, which means the obligation is the agent's. You have an affirmative obligation. You have to do it. You got to try to make reasonable efforts to determine whether the prospect is subject to a valid agreement. So reasonable. That's where it all hinges, right? What is reasonable? And I think that's what you'll be judged on ultimately. If it turns out that buyer is represented, is already in some agreement with another agent, then the big question will be whether the second agent took reasonable steps to determine whether or not that buyer was subject to an agreement. So what's reasonable? Well, asking, there's a start, right? Pretty reasonable to say, did you ask? If you didn't, might not be very reasonable. And then, ask and then explain. I think now we're in an era where we need to explain. Okay, and I think using an agreement is a helpful way to do it. So, for instance, the UAR buyer broker agreement, right in there it says, the buyer warrants that they're not working with another agent. They haven't signed one of these with another agent. But then it also goes on to give you a paragraph, a blank section to list out properties that could be exempt from this agreement. And really that's meant to be, yes, it's a useful tool to exempt properties, but it's also there to spur conversation, right? Because now we can stop and say, hey, are we going to, do we need to use this? Is there anything in there? Is there another agreement floating around that we need to protect you from with this blank, this section? And, that may help the buyer understand, oh, okay, so you're saying if I have signed something, we can deal with it. Yes, we don't want you to be double obligated. It's not in your best interest. It's not in my best interest. It's not in anybody's best interest to have you sign competing agreements. And it's meant to help facilitate a good conversation around that, to help the buyer understand. And there will probably be times where a buyer doesn't understand or potentially gives bad information. And I think, again, it'll all hinge on whether the buyer's agent took reasonable efforts. And that'll be the key. So make sure we explain these really well. And then I think it's a two-part thing too. You are explaining when you're signing it to make sure they haven't signed something prior. The buyer hasn't signed something else, a competing agreement. But then you're also explaining when you are the first agent to sign something with this buyer. You explain really well, hey, buyer, please don't sign a competing agreement. Here's what happens. Here's the trouble it causes. Please be aware you are signing an agreement with me, and I'm around. I'm available. Here is someone else on my team you can get a hold of if I'm not around that day or you can't get a hold of me in a reasonable time frame. Here's a backup. Facilitate the ability for the buyer and the understanding in the buyer to relay that information to a listing agent, another buyer's agent, so that they can understand, this is important that this information is presented when you are asked by another agent, are you represented? Yes, I understand as a buyer, I have signed something, and here's my agent's card, and here's my agent's information, and go from there. So again, that's not really new, because that's the same kind of stuff we should have been doing prior to this. I think a lot of you were doing prior to this. So it's just, it's really not new information here. So hopefully that helps. Remember, this is not legal information. This is legal information. This is not legal advice. This is legal information only. If you need specific legal advice, please contact your attorney. Thanks for tuning in.